It's been 2 weeks since the war in Gaza began with the Hamas attacks on Israel. And when I say this war, I don't mean to imply that the ethical, historical narrative begins 2 weeks ago. One of the big problems with a lot of the rhetoric that surrounds this conflict is the process of truncating the antecedents, starting the story at a certain point to reach a certain conclusion, to cast a certain trajectory. This is something that happens constantly in this struggle. It happens all the time, and to a point, this is kind of necessary. You don't necessarily want to always go through all the history up to mitochondrial Eve or the Big Bang every time you talk about any issue. But in this case, there's a lot of relevant stuff that will often be cut out. Now, I've made videos about this before. I think that if you followed my channel closely, you're not going to be super surprised by anything I have to say. But this is a really, really bad situation. So I think I want to talk about a couple takes. One, I guess I'll start with this, with the attacks themselves and some of the takes on that, and then we'll go into the history. So the Hamas attacks were unprecedented. It's a surprise to everybody, myself included, that they were able to breach the perimeter wall around Gaza so effectively and cause so much carnage in the surrounding areas. This was kind of akin to the the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Not that they could do it, but that they would do it. In that case, we didn't think that the Russians would invade. At least I didn't think. Um, and then, of course, they were able to do it. Wasn't really that much of a surprise. In this case, the fact that Hamas was able to launch this attack so successfully surprised me. It surprised a lot of people. And just looking at the ethics of the attack, there's a couple things that come to mind. I spent time going through watching videos, examining this stuff. Not fun to do, but I feel like it's important if you want to try and understand what's happening. When I see the Hamas fighters, terrorists, whatever you want to call them, both labels could apply in many cases, attacking IDF tanks or IDF bases, I have a hard time saying that that's totally wrong. The Israeli government has been very aggressive and bullyish and high-handed with the Palestinians, for good or ill. We can go into that, maybe we will. But they're military targets, and even though I don't like seeing that happen, and I think it's going way too far when they start desecrating bodies, and I did see compelling evidence of things like decapitations happening. We'll get into some of the other claims later, but I can understand that. Now, is it wise? That's something that I have less ability to understand. Uh, but then when they start kidnapping and then murdering civilians and desecrating civilians and murdering, decapitating civilians, which also happened a few times, that is not justified by anything that happened in the past, right? There's no, but it's also, I can understand on multiple levels, and I'm not justifying this. It completely, for lack of a better term, barbaric to go into massacre people by the hundreds and indeed over 1,000. And I could almost, as a tactic, like I understand the kidnappings. I would not justify the kidnappings, but I can understand them because in the past, Hamas and Hezbollah both have captured Israelis and been able to gain a great deal from that. There was a single Israeli soldier who was exchanged for over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. And so if you think about that, well, if you get 100 or 200, as it seems like they captured over 200, I mean, what kind of concessions could they maybe hope to achieve with that? But the calculus totally changes when you start massacring people in numbers, old people, children. There have been some claims made about decapitation of babies. Interesting that they made the claims and are very adamant that they're true, but then will not show the proof. I haven't heard testimony that I find compelling that it's true. It also doesn't really matter. There is absolute evidence and testimony that I do find relevant that they killed children. And whether or not they decapitated them or not, in addition to that, is ethically totally irrelevant, at least to me. It doesn't mean you can't kill non-combatant. I did see an interview with I forget what they're called, but they perform like a last rites to bodies in the Jewish system. And this guy had been actually in 9/11, and he said some of the stuff he saw in the kibbutzes was the worst stuff he ever saw, way worse than 9/11. And he reported and broke down. And this guy was not. I mean, he said that he was so sympathetic to the Palestinians that he wishes he could take Gazan children into his home now after this attack, right? But he said that, he was finding children, 8 to 12 to 15, bound, executed, and burned. Okay, so there's no justification for that, and it's the Israeli rage after that is palpable and understandable. But you have to realize the other thing is that these attacks were very clearly, carefully planned and executed. I kind of kept thinking this is like the Shawshank Redemption of military campaigns or attacks, however you want to describe it, because there are all these massive defenses, and Hamas was able to secretly, and we'll maybe address that bit a little bit later, breach those defenses. And they clearly had a plan to capture hostages. There's lots of videos of that. It's clear that they have people in a position where they could kill them and they don't. So I don't know if this is a function of a lot of Hamas fighters got out of there and some of them didn't get the memo, or some of them didn't care, or some of them in the process got worked up, or what. But because it does seem like there was a very, very strategic attempt, A, to escape, but then B, to capture as many Israelis as possible. And given the success that they've had in the past with leveraging that for hostage exchanges, that makes sense. But they had to know that there would be a massive, massive retaliation because of this. And it was so certain that we have to assume they knew that was going to happen, and they either want that to happen or they're totally okay with that to happen. And this is where, even if I can understand the plight of the Gazans and the plight of the Palestinians and their anger and rage at the Israelis, which I will go into some, the ethics of Hamas here are extremely dubious, because it does seem very likely that they are banking on the mass suffering and casualties of their own people in the hopes that this will give something. Now, what that something is not clear. It seems very likely that it's supposed to reduce the détente that's been happening between Israel and other Arab states. In this case, very specifically, it seems like Saudi Arabia was, relations with Israel and Saudi Arabia were about to be normalized, and that has been basically put on pause, at least for now. And that very likely was one of the hoped for results. But if that's the case, then we're talking about thousands. It's now thousands of Gazans who have been killed, not to mention the property damage within the Strip. For what? To stop that deal from going on, to pause the Abraham Accords, or to push the Abraham Accords back? That's a calculus, if that's truly what it was, that's just sickening. I know of very few examples of that. There is, the only thing that kind of came to mind is in World War II between China and Japan. When that war first started, the fighting was only in Manchuria. There was fighting in Manchuria going back to 1931, and in 1937 Chiang Kai-shek decided to expand the war because it would exhaust the Japanese more, and so he started attacking Japanese enclaves in like Shanghai, and it worked. The Japanese did extend the war into like mainland, the most populated part of China, and the Yangtze Delta and other places along the coast. And this did indeed have the desired effect of spreading the Japanese out and committing them more and kind of acting as a millstone around their state. But it also resulted in the deaths of millions over the course of the entire war, over 13 million Chinese people. And that was calculus that Chiang Kai-shek made. I mean, he knew that was going to happen, and he did it anyway. And the utter disregard he had for the lives of his people, even in terms of his rhetoric, was just shocking. And it's not too hard to see why people would turn to somebody else, although the person they turned to ended up being even worse. It seems like that's where Hamas is at this point, that they want to bring the Israelis down on them hard. Maybe they think it will generate support. Maybe they're hoping that there'll be a general war, that surrounding Arab states get involved. I think that's highly, highly unlikely. And so, yeah, we don't know. It's just interesting that they obviously, but I think people need to really realize there was a lot of planning that went into this. This was very, very meticulously thought about. They had to know what was going to happen, and that had to be what they wanted. Does that mean that they think that they're going to bloody the Israelis even more? If the Israelis go into Gaza, which as of this video they haven't yet, they obviously will bloody the Israelis a great deal more, but not enough to, destroy the Israeli state. They'll kill more soldiers. They'll destroy more stuff. They'll cause more ill will, but at the price of what? So, these attacks were horrible, horrifying, like ghastly, and you can understand the wrath of the Israelis. But you also have to step back and understand, what are the Palestinians supposed to do? I'm not justifying this, and I kind of see when I was watching Max Blumenthal speak about this, and I've read some of his books. I respect his opinion, but when he referred to the dance massacre, the dance party, and he kind of frames it as, well, those Mali-induced hippies, as if it makes any difference what drugs they were or were not doing at the dance festival before 260 of them were brutally murdered. It doesn't. Just the reflexive attempt to shine the shit there was a little bit nauseating. And so you do see that happening. But then you see the righteous indignation of these Israelis. But let's go back. There have been so many bad takes here. There's a fundamental delusion in Zionism, or an unwillingness to confront the reality that Zionism, as it's usually envisioned, requires the elimination through extermination or migration of the entire populace that's not Jewish, or enough of the populace that's not Jewish that Jewish hegemony is always guaranteed. Think about it like this. I was watching Andrew Gold, and he was saying people say Israel is an apartheid state. Israel is an apartheid state. And that's ridiculous because there's lots of Arabs in Israel. And I don't know how he thinks that, because there were lots of blacks in South Africa. Apartheid did not mean that there were no blacks in South Africa. It just meant that there was a two-tiered system where blacks had far fewer rights compared to whites. And also there were designated areas, these Bantustans, these districts where they could live. And sure enough, in Israel, there are Arabs indeed in Israel proper. There's lots of other Arabs, and I'll say Arab instead of Palestinian to kind of go along with the Zionist rhetoric here. But Arabs do not have the same rights, and they have districts for them. And they'll say that there's no apartheid, but then they'll also say Israel is a Jewish state or a Jewish democracy. What does that mean? What does a Jewish state or Jewish democracy mean? Does it just mean that it's a democratic state like any other, that you have elections and you have representation and equality and rights and all that. And the answer has to be no, because otherwise you would just say democracy or human rights. But they say Jewish democracy or Jewish state. And Andrew Gold even emphasized, I feel like I want to have a place that's run by Jews just in case things get really bad. Now, there's a lot of bad logic in there, I would argue, especially in the area of nuclear weapons. If you put all the Jews in one spot, then they're easier to wipe out. I mean, it's just a fact. If Jews are dispersed, and there's some in every country or many countries, then they're really, unless you have a global demographic catastrophe that kills everyone on the whole planet, you're not going to kill all the Jews. But if you put them all into a relatively small New Jersey-sized piece of land on the east coast of the Mediterranean, well, maybe it's possible. And there are indeed quotes from leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah to that effect. I hope all the Jews come to Israel so that they can be killed. You know, in the age of nukes, which predates the state of Israel by, 2-3 years, having them all be in one spot does not guarantee Jews' existence. And if you want to say, well, I don't want to be persecuted in my country, and Andrew Gold lives in the UK, and, you know, persecutions of Jews have happened. They're historically something that is a non-zero chance of happening. But the odds that it happens everywhere it's never happened everywhere. So like when there were pogroms happening in Russia or in Poland in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, there was no Israel for those people to go to, but yet millions of them did leave and they found refuge someplace else, specifically most of them in the United States, right? Which still has, Israel and the United States have almost the same population of Jews. Israel has about 7 million, the USA has about 6 million, right? But it's not the only one. They could have gone to Australia or the UK or any of these other countries. So the idea that there has to be one doesn't really make sense. When these really bad anti-Semitic things were happening, including the worst ones, including the Holocaust, were happening in the 19th and 20th centuries, there was no Israel for them to fall back on, and yet millions of them escaped and did fine, and they didn't need a Zionist state to go to. In fact, having a Zionist state for them all to go to, I mean, if you think about if you say, well, what if every country becomes anti-Semitic and every country wants to wipe out the Jews, and so you can't go to the United States or Canada or New Zealand because they're all anti-Semitic and they all want to exterminate the Jews. If every country in the world wants to exterminate the Jews, I'm going to argue that it doesn't matter if they have their own state in that point. Because you're talking about a situation where not only their own neighbors, but the entire world is against them, right? That's the counterfactual. That's the hypothetical that they're drawing up, is that there has to be Israel because there has to be a place I can go. Well, you could always just go someplace else unless every place is anti-Semitic. And if every place is anti-Semitic, it doesn't matter if you have Israel. But then the other part is this idea that it has to be a Jewish state. Well, if it has to be a Jewish state or a Jewish democracy, that means that by one way or another, non-Jews, whatever rights they have, whatever representation they have, can never have ultimate decision-making power in the state of Israel. Then it won't be a Jewish state anymore. So how do Zionists feel about people who are not Jews in their state? They have a range of opinions. And some of them think of them, I mean, there are certain religious Jews who just think of non-Jews as goyim, as scum, as the same value as a snake. You know, there's Jews who believe that all this ethical stuff in the Ten Commandments and all these moral rules that they're supposed to follow only apply to Jews, and that it's fine to murder people who are not Jews. Now, do all Jews think that? No, of course not. Of course not, but many of them do, especially the more religious ones. And you can see that on display in this war, is giving that segment of Israeli society a lot of vent where they can go and do that. But you have even very racist Jewish supremacists who they don't want to kill everyone else. I've seen the Mayor Kahanes of the world saying things like, I don't want to get rid of the Arabs. Every neighborhood needs an Arab to come and take out the trash, right? So they don't necessarily want to kill everyone. They just want to have them be a permanent underclass. Or, there's others who might say, oh, well, I don't think that Jews are superior, but we do need to have a Jewish state. So like, if we allow non-Jews or Arabs to vote, that's fine. But ultimately, no matter what, their voting power must always be below the voting power of the Jews. They must never be able to question the Jewish character of the state, even if there's demographic or electoral reasons why maybe they should. So if you want to say that's not apartheid because it's not exactly like South African apartheid, well, then I agree. It's not exactly like South African apartheid. It's not based on race per se. It's based on religion or ethnicity to the extent, because of course, a lot of Jews are atheists. They identify as Jews, but then say that they're Jewish. But the character of the Jewish state of Zionism is that it must stay Jewish. Can Arabs serve in the Knesset? Yes, they can. Can Arabs have jobs? Yes, they can. Can Arabs vote? In Israel, some Arabs can vote. Some Christian Arabs, some Druze, and some Muslim Arabs. But the point is that their political power must always be, always, regardless of how many of them there are, regardless of how active they are, regardless of how much wealth they do or do not have, they always must be subsidiary and weaker, the minority group in Israel, always, by definition. That's what Zionism means. That's what it means when you say a Jewish state or a Jewish democracy. That means that whatever other groups that are there that are non-Jewish, their political power must be lower. And just imagine, just apply that to any other thing. You could say in the United States, if you were to say, yes, you can have two parties, we can have Democrats, we can have Republicans, it's all equal, but the Democrats must always be in control. The Democrats must always have the presidency. They must always have a majority in both houses of Congress. They must always have supremacy in the courts. They must always have supremacy over legislation. They must always have power over the army. So yes, you can have Republicans, but they can never, ever have policy control, ever. They can have input. We can listen to them if they want, just like in Hawaii or California. They can protest and they can vote, but they can never have control. The control always has to stay with the Democratic Party. Well, how is that not, in this case, it's not racist because you're dealing with parties, but like, how is that not patently unfair and also patently undemocratic? And I'm not somebody who treats democracy as a shibboleth. I don't believe in democracy in that way. I don't think there's any secret here. But from the point of view of all these other people, the Andrew Golds and the Colemans and the Ben Shapiro's of the world, they all say that they do. But they don't in the case of Zionism, democracy is less important than Jewish supremacy. Jewish supremacy is the ultimate arbiter of what is right and what is wrong in Israel. If you're a Zionist. Now, if there are people in Israel who are not Zionists, right? So there's people in Israel there's everything I'm saying, you could find someone in Israel or a Jew in the United States who would say the same thing. So again, this is not saying that all Jews feel this way, because they don't. The Jews have a plethora of views on this. Yes, of course, there's more in one than the other, but so then you have this problem of what do you do with the people who are not Jews? Because there's millions of them. There's something like 2 million Arabs in Israel proper. There's something like 4 or 5 million more in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I think there's 2 million in Gaza, 2.2, we don't know exactly, and it's something like 3 or 4 in the West Bank. And well, that's a very good question. Those areas are completely under the control of Israel, though. All right, so the West Bank is not part of Jordan. Jordan has no control there. The Gaza Strip is not part of Egypt. Egypt has no control there. The Golan Heights are not part of Syria. They've been taken over by Israel. Israel makes policy there. And when you listen to Israelis, they vary on this. So even people like Itzhak Rabin or Menachem Begin thought we should immediately leave the West Bank because we don't want them part of our Jewish state. We want them to be their own thing, whether they're part of Jordan or their own state. We just cannot incorporate them into Israel because Israel needs to be Jewish, and that's too many people who are not Jewish. But then you hear other people, and you'll hear this term a lot. It seems innocuous, but it's really not. You'll hear people refer to, and I heard Ben Shapiro say this, he called it the so-called West Bank. And then he clarifies, but actually Judea and Sumeria. Why would you call it that? Why would you telescope a name from the first millennium BCE and say, I'm going to call it that? And even like in quotes, the so-called West Bank. You're only calling it that because he wants that to become part of Israel. And we know this is the whole settler movement is based on this, that there's people in Israel who think all of that because it used to be called Judea and Sumeria, based by, and we'll get into the historical telescoping here in a second, but like, so that all belongs to us. And it kind of reminds me a lot of how when Russia invades Ukraine, they start referring to Novorossiysk. It's Novorossiya. They'll come and they'll say like, oh, this is not Ukraine. This was all part of Russia once. And what's funny is I'm sure Ben Shapiro would find that ridiculous. And like, how, it doesn't legitimize a Russian invasion of Ukraine to start using place names from 300 years ago. And he'd be right to criticize them for doing that. But the Russians, because the antiquity of their claims are much more recent, right? You're talking about Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. You're talking about the 16th or the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, as opposed to the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries BCE, which is what you're talking about when you're talking about Judea and Sumeria, right? To legitimize their conquest. And so here's the other thing. There's this attempt to just kind of erase Palestinians. There's this myth that there was simply no people there. From time immemorial is a famous book that kind of purported this has been completely debunked, but you still have a lot of Jews who are Zionists. All right, so this isn't true of necessarily Jews who are not Zionists, but a lot of Zionists would say, we were a people without a land, and this was a land without a people, and they just pretend like there was no people there. But we know, like by the time of the Balfour Declaration in the 1917, when the British Protectorate began, there were something like 700,000 or 800,000 people who lived in that area, right? And they didn't just suddenly appear. There'd been people there, and some of those people were Jewish, by the way. There was a small group of people who were Jewish in that area, for sure. But most of and then there's this, oh well, those people weren't Palestinian. They weren't Palestinians. They were just Arabs, as if that makes any difference. I was watching one guy who's in Israel. He goes, I'm only going to talk about facts, and the facts are that there's no such thing as Palestinians. There's no references to Palestinians in the 1800s. Okay, well, I don't know for sure if that's true. It could well be. Usually when I heard references to the people in the area from back then, they would say Arabs, or maybe even specify like what clan or tribe, if they're Hawitat or Halith. But then that doesn't really matter. I mean, who cares if they're Arabs? Like, this is another thing that's like, well, there's all these other Arab countries, so they're like, you don't have, a person does not have rights because they're in a certain group or not. Like, so I live in West Manchester, right? I moved here 10 years ago, and I've lived here for a long time. I could have been born here, but let's say somebody just shows up and says, you know what, we're going to evict half the population from West Manchester because we want to claim it for ourselves. And then we protest, and then they say, there's no such thing as a Westmancherite. There's no term for that. If you look in history, there's no special term given to people from West Manchester. It doesn't exist, and so you don't have any rights. Bullshit. Also, what other term was never used in the 19th century to refer to anybody in that area? Israeli. Nobody. There's no references to Israelites or Israelis living in anywhere in the whole world in the 18th century or the 19th century, because they didn't exist. There was no Israeli state until 1947, right? So, yes, maybe, I mean, I don't know. Maybe there are references to Palestinians, but let's just, for the sake of argument, assume there were no references to Palestinians. There were still people there, and the fact that you could decide to classify them into a larger group doesn't mean that they suddenly don't have any rights or any agency. Right? It doesn't mean that they can just have their land given away by the United Nations on a whim. And it's also funny how Israel's legitimacy is based on the United Nations, but then also they reject the United Nations whenever the United Nations, says, hey, you got to go to the 67 borders. You can't occupy the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So their complete inability to come to terms with the fact that there were people already there and that they can't have a Jewish state with those people there. So they either have to kill them all or force them all to leave. And that just looks really, really bad. And there are people in Israel who would be willing to do that. There's people in Israel during the, and it's so, there's a certain mendacity here. During the war, when so the United Nations just says we're going to get. I mean, you could go back. I just watched a great documentary on how the Balfour Declaration and the British basically double dealed, right? So World War One's happening. The British are fighting a war against mostly the Germans and the Austrians, but also the Ottoman Empire, which had occupied that area for hundreds of years at that point. And to help in the war effort, they went to the Arabs and said, if you revolt against the Ottomans, then we'll support your statehood after the fact. And the Arabs did revolt. They did contribute to the Allied effort. Debatable how much, but they definitely did. If you want to watch a super famous movie about that, which isn't, it makes you familiar if it doesn't necessarily cover every historical point perfectly. Lawrence of Arabia covers that exact period where they went to the Arabs and said, rebel against the Ottomans and we will support you. And they did. But then they also went to the Jews, not the ones who lived in Palestine, mind you, but they were actually targeting Jews in the United States who owned newspapers and Jews in the Soviet Union. So 1917 comes around and there's a big, huge problem. One smaller problem is that the United States is not in the war. And the bigger problem is that Russia is about to drop out of the war. Now, if Russia drops out of the war and the United States doesn't enter the war, it's very likely that Germany is going to defeat France and the UK. So what does the United Kingdom do? They think, well, a lot of communists are Jews. So if we do something that will please the communists that are Jews, then the Soviet Union, when it comes about, it hadn't come about yet, but there was a revolution happening. They will support us. This was the hope. And also, all these media moguls in the United States who are Jewish, they'll love us too, and then they'll give us good press, and that will lead to the United States entering the war. On the second point, it kind of worked. So yes, a lot of American Jews loved this idea, and they gave them better press, and eventually the United States joined the war, although it would be a big stretch to say that's the reason. There were other reasons, but that was a contributing factor. They completely misjudged the Marxists. The Bolsheviks, yes, it's true, many of them were Jewish, but they were internationalists. They didn't believe in nationalism. So Trotsky, yes, was Jewish, but no, was not going to be placated with Zionism because they wanted a universal communist state. They didn't want a Jewish state in Palestine. And so this was a huge miscalculated. And they basically double dealed, and they promised the Arabs that they could have something, and they promised the Jews they could have something. They ended up breaking the promise to the Arabs and not to the Jews. And you fast forward to the United Nations, and the United Nations just says, we're going to give a certain amount of this land to the Jews. Now, a lot of Israelis will make it seem like, well, then, the war that followed of extermination was just, another attempt at genocide. Look, how would you feel if the United Nations just gave away your land? If the United Nations just said, hey, you know what? There's lots of Americans. There's 330 million Americans. They don't need the state of New Jersey. So we're going to clear out the state of New Jersey and give it to the Abenaki because they were here first, right? Or the Pequot, right? Pequot used to live in Connecticut. They got exterminated. There's still some of them around, or people who claim to be Pequot. United Nations could come and say, look, there's 49 other states. This is just one state. It should belong to the Pequot. We're going to kick out everybody. Says who? Says the United Nations. Why does the United Nations have the right to do that? Because they kind of don't, right? And, the United States and Israel completely ignore the United Nations when it's in their interests. I mean, the United Nations was kind of built by the United States so they can veto anything that they want there. But if that wasn't the case, if they League of Nations and left, they would do the same thing. They completely ignore it. It has no rights, right? And so the Arabs living in the area Again, I don't have to call them Palestinians. The Arabs living in the area and Arabs living around the area went to war with Israel. The only problem was the Israeli state had an army before, had a functioning army before they had a state, right? The Irgun and the Haganah had existed before that. They'd been trained, they'd been operating during the time of the Mandate when they were committing acts of terrorism against the British. Ironically, they bombed the King George Hotel, killing 135 people, I think, and fucking Sunak, Prime Minister Sunak, just stayed there like last week. Crazy. But anyway, these Arab states did not have functioning armies other than a couple Jordanian units that had been trained by the British, and the Israelis won. But that doesn't change the fact that there are people, and then they forced all these Palestinians to leave in this event known as the Nakba, which you will now, even to this day, you will hear Zionists say that this never happened. There's no such thing as the Nakba. It's all a myth. And then when you confront them, well, where did all the people go? Like, oh, well, the Arabs made them leave. Their leaders forced them to leave, even though there's documentation that many of the Haganah, the Stern Gang, the Irgun, they wanted to ethnically cleanse the area. If that meant massacring Arabs, they did that. If that meant chasing them out of their villages, they did that. They did whatever it takes to steal the land and give it to themselves, because they were Jewish supremacists, many of them. And if they weren't Jewish supremacists, they just thought, well, we're special and we should have this land, and they shouldn't. And then you'll have these Jewish intellectuals deny that this even happened, but then you'll see a video on the street where, an Israeli citizen will taunt an Arab and be like, we'll Nakba you again. So it's completely mendacious. So they have this complete disconnect from reality where they want all that land, some of them. Look, there are people in Israel who do not want the West Bank, and that's actually one of the interesting, brighter spots of this. There's a lot of people in Israel, so these people are probably Zionists, but who think that the whole settlement thing in the West Bank in particular is a huge mistake. That a huge part of their military is devoted to defending and making secure these zealots, and that's what they are. These are the people. The settlers in the West Bank are zealots. Okay, so there's more moderate Zionists who we can have a conversation with, right? But these are the people who they'll say Judea and Samaria, and they think it's all theirs, and they can do whatever they want because God fucking said so, right? And because they're in a majority Palestinian area or Arab area, they need a lot of protection. And there have been reports that the Gaza division that's supposed to defend Gaza was kind of there. I don't know if that's absolutely true, but there's been a lot of reports to that effect. And another thing that I found very interesting, very, very interesting right after this is Israeli woman, the day of the attacks on the 7th, it was a holiday. I forget which one it was. Was it Yom Kippur yet, or was it the day before? It was Yom Kippur. Anyway, there are all these Orthodox Jews who are celebrating the holiday, and they're dancing. They're out in the street, dancing in a big circle as they do, and singing and in joyous rapture. And this more secular Israeli is absolutely livid because thousands. We didn't know the numbers yet, but hundreds, and as it turned out, over 1,000 Israelis were getting butchered that very same day. And these Orthodox Jews had nothing better to do but throw a party and to celebrate. And not only that, they're exempted from military service. So they want to dance and sing and, just jerk off to their fucking religion, which their whole life revolves around. But then they don't want to give their due to the state. They want to be exempted from military service. They don't want to take part in the army. They just want the army to defend them so they can do whatever the fuck they want, including piss off the natives, including murder them, steal their land, steal their water, bisect their territory as much as they want, and just lord it over them because God said so. Oh, and by the way, all the secular Jews, you need to run the army to defend us from the wrath of the people that we're oppressing. So there's a lot of people in Israel. I saw another video where I think he was an Air Force or a Special Forces guy went into a fucking yeshiva school. And all these Jewish young men who are, in late teens, early 20s, who are military age, are just sitting there reading the same fucking goddamn book that they've been reading their whole fucking lives, right? Doesn't matter if you read the Talmud, bitch. Everyone's read the Talmud. People have been reading the Talmud for thousands of years. Anyone sitting in that room has probably already read it 100 times over. We're in a national emergency, and you can't even be bothered to get up from your fucking study bed. And look, I'm coming from the perspective of like, I'd rather they do that. I don't think that they should be drafted. I don't think that they should be forced, right? I don't think they should have to pay fucking taxes. But I can totally understand the point of view of somebody who says we're all supposed to go and contribute. We're supposed to defend. We're supposed to risk our lives, and you can't even get up off your fucking study table. And how pissed do you think that makes those Israelis? Yeah, it's absurd. And those are the people who cannot be reasoned with when it comes to the West Bank or the Gaza Strip in so-called Judea and Sumeria. We could go on that forever. Here's another thing. It's fascinating watching people's reactions and juxtaposing this to the war in Ukraine. By any metric that you can think about, the war in Ukraine is worse and also geopolitically more important. That whole area is Muslim, is Arab. If the Muslims and the Arabs take Israel, it doesn't matter a peep to the United States. No difference. It'd be fine. I have a lot of friends in Israel, and I don't think there's any really danger of that happening. That's the big difference. Russia had a chance to take Ukraine. They could win that war. The Ukrainian state is at risk of being destroyed. At least initially, that was certainly the case. I think that's very unlikely now. But Russia clearly wanted to annex or at least create a puppet state out of Ukraine. There is no chance that Hamas will do that to Israel. There is no chance that a combination of Hamas and Hezbollah will do that to Israel. Could they launch a war? Could they cause a lot of casualties? Yes, absolutely. Could they take a lot of prisoners? Yes, absolutely. Could they strain the Israeli budget? Yes, that's happening now. Are they going to overthrow the Zionist state? No. If worse got to worse, the Israelis not only have nukes, but they have second-strike capability because they have nuclear submarines based out of Haifa. So, and everybody knows that. Even if some of the other Arab states around there got involved, whether it was Egypt or Jordan or Syria or Lebanon or Saudi Arabia, it's not going to happen. Of course, that's not going to happen. Where does Saudi Arabia get its military from? Oh, it gets it from the United States. Egypt, and it's also interesting. I saw one Gazan who was asked who's to blame, and he actually blamed the other Arab states because they'll say they love Palestine, they'll say they want to help Palestine, blah, 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 but at the end of the day, they're not letting Palestinians leave. Egypt is not letting Palestinians flee to Egypt. Palestinian refugees are not welcome in Lebanon. They're not welcome in Jordan. They're not welcome in Saudi Arabia. There's reasons for this that are, if not justified, at least understandable, because they had a tendency to try and overthrow the governments. They tried to overthrow the government in Jordan. They tried to overthrow the government in Lebanon. You could see them maybe not being considered the best guess. And again, not to generalize, most of them would never do that, but there's organizations within them that are quite radical, they're quite motivated, and they'll do whatever it takes to get what they want. And if your state's not giving them what they want, then maybe they'll try and overthrow your state. But my point is, there is no chance that these organizations, these paramilitary groups, whatever their successes, whatever their cunning, whatever their preparation, they're not going to overthrow the Israeli state. Something that could have happened in Ukraine. Also, just in terms of sheer numbers, it's ridiculous. I mean, okay, a couple fighters on motorbikes, yes, is well planned. They got AK-47s. They had some drones. Russia had 10,000 tanks and a huge air force, nuclear ballistic missiles, a navy, 130 million people in their right? So like just no comparison. And it's fascinating to see the difference in the way Americans react. Yes, there's been a lot of support for Ukraine, but there's also been a lot of people who never supported Ukraine and won't support Ukraine. And I'm not saying they should, by the way. I don't think the United States is obligated to help Ukraine. I'm showing this as a juxtaposition. And yet who will jump immediately. Israel gets whatever it needs. We will support Israel 100%. Whatever Israel needs, Israel gets. Isn't that fascinating? Why is that? What does Israel give to the United States that's worth any of that? That it's a democracy? Wrong. It's a Jewish democracy, right? Oh, by the way, one that the on again, off again prime minister was trying to eliminate the checks and balances of the Supreme Court, right? I'm sure most of you have heard of that. There were huge problems in Israel just before this happening when it's Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to introduce reforms that would hamstring the court and allow him to have even more power. And I don't necessarily think he's doing that because he wants to personally be a dictator, although that's not beyond the realm of possibility. But this was causing massive protests in Israel. Thousands and thousands of IDF soldiers were saying, I'm not going to show up. I'm not going to perform my duties because I can't support this. And now that's kind of been put on hold, but it is not forgotten. And that's another thing that I've been happy to see is that this has definitely not been forgotten, these issues. So there's a glimmer of hope in that at the very least. I also want to talk a little bit about Ben Shapiro. So Ben Shapiro has been getting so emotional about this that sometimes he's starting to have a Jewish accent, which I think is hilarious. I've never noticed him have a Jewish accent, but now sometimes he does. But he'll go into these self-righteous rants, and he'll start to list the litany of all the persecutions of the Jews, and he'll talk about Masada, and he'll talk about the destruction of the Second Temple, and he'll talk about the destruction of the First Temple, and the first exile in Egypt. Okay. Who destroyed the First Temple? Right, is the Babylonians. Right. When did the Second Temple get destroyed? In 71 A.D. Who did that? The Romans. No, it wasn't the Palestinians. It wasn't the Arabs. It was the Romans who did that. Of course, it was the Egyptians who were persecuting them, for however long that happened, if indeed that happened. And then he talks about Masada. For those of you who don't know, Masada is a fortress on the Dead Sea. It was originally a palace that was built by Herod the Great. And during the second Judean revolt, there were two Judean revolts against the Romans. And in the second one, where Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed, there were some zealots, literally zealots, who held out on Masada. Masada was eventually taken, and everyone there was slaughtered. Right. So this was a rebellion. By the way, everything we know about this pretty much comes from a character known as Josephus. Josephus is a Judean Roman, right? So he was Jewish. He was from Judea. He was born in Jerusalem. They think he was born about the same year Jesus was executed, probably 37, 36 A.D. And then he was a leader in the Judean revolt, but then was captured by the Romans and then became a big proponent of Roman rule, advising Titus, who later became the first Flavian emperor. And he wrote a history about this revolt. And so we have everything we know about the Battle of Masada is from somebody who almost all Jews today would consider a horrible traitor who helped the Romans. But anyway, my point is, Ben is getting all worked up and angry about events that happened almost 2,000 years ago, in some cases more than 2,000 years ago, that he did not take part in. We don't know that his family is even descended from anybody who took part in that. I mean, if they were from Masada, no, because they all got murdered. They all committed suicides, so according to Josephus. But then the offending state in this case, it wasn't Iran, it wasn't Saudi Arabia, it wasn't the PLO, it wasn't Hamas, it was the Romans. So it's like there's this collective, all the pogroms in Russia, the Holocaust, the Dreyfus Affair in France, the expulsion of the Jews from Paducah, Kentucky by USS Grant in 1860. All of that is now manifest in every single Arab on the street in the West Bank somehow. And he just, all that collective guilt is vested in them. That's how we talk. I mean, why is he bringing it up? But I think he should think about this, because it's absolutely true that Masada, even though everything we know about that is written from the point of view of a Jewish traitor by Josephus, but That and the revolt are both cases of Judea, of Jews fighting overwhelming odds and getting crushed. Right? They launched a holy war of liberation against the Romans, and the Romans just smacked them down like they did to everyone. And they, by the way, they did that to everyone. I don't know, like, oh, they picked on the Jews. Dude, ask the Carthaginians about what the Romans do. Oh, you can't because there are no Carthaginians. There's no exile of the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians were wiped out. They don't exist. They haven't existed since 214 BC. Uh, what did the Romans do to the Gauls? What did the Romans do to the Spanish? What did the Romans do to the other people in Italy, to the Sarmatians, right? They did that to everybody. And yes, they did it to the Jews when the Jews rebelled. And part of Josephus's argument was the Romans brought us peace. The Romans brought us stability. We could have had the temple. We could have had everything. They weren't going to stop us from worshiping our God. And then we stupidly rebelled against overwhelming odds, and they crushed us. Does that not sound familiar to what's happening right now? In his wrath, in his advocacy for what Israel should do. Now, I shouldn't just focus on Ben Shapiro, but what Israel is doing to Gaza right now is giving the Gazans what the Judeans got from the revolt and from Masada. Even if you want to say that there was no identity there before, if there's no such thing as Palestinians, which again, it doesn't matter. You can't just erase people's rights and take their land and make them subordinate to you just because they're not part of a group that you've identified. That's not, you don't have group rights in that way. Nobody does. But when you start to give them a collective experience, then they start to have stuff in common. And sure, you could say all the people in Gaza are just fucking Arabs, but the people in Saudi Arabia and Egypt and in Jordan are not suffering what Gaza suffers. The people in Gaza have a unique experience all to their own that Israel is giving them. And if they're anything like the Jews, even if they are completely defeated in every way, that can give them something that can give them identity and purpose so much that 2,000 years later, the Gazan equivalent of Ben Shapiro is going to give everyone a lecture about the history of the greatness of his Gazan people or Palestinian people because of how they were brutally attacked by the horrible nuke-wielding Zionist empire of Benjamin Netanyahu, or however the history is viewed at that point, right? This is not going to serve. The only thing that's really going to benefit from this is things like Gazan nationalism and Palestinian nationalism, because they're not going to exterminate everybody. I'm sure there are people, the Zionists, who wish that they could do that and want to do that, but they can't, right? They want to pretend. It's just like the people who say there's no apartheid, but there's also a Jewish state. What are you talking about? They want that, but they don't want to confront the reality of what that means. So, there was this period. Look, the two-state solution has been U.S. policy forever. It's the policy of all the Arab states around there, and even many Israelis, including people in Likud over the years, including some of their most famous prime ministers. That's been their policy. But some people in Israel, including Benjamin Netanyahu and others, don't like that. They don't like that because some of them are Jewish supremacists who just think all that land should ultimately belong to Israel. And so by hook or by crook, they're going to steal it. But how? When there's millions of people who live there and there's cameras everywhere. It's not 1948, right? So they can't just do that without everyone seeing what they're doing. And then there's others who, they'll make policy, like, oh, well, we can't allow those states to exist because then they could be used as springboards. But look, Israel's got nukes. Israel has a powerful military. They're just adding fury to these people. And they have nothing else to live for. And again, talk to Max Blumenthal, he'll talk about, the standard of living in Gaza are so small, so bad, it's so terrible. And so he's kind of trying to justify the attacks. And like, yeah, but the conditions now in Gaza are even worse because there's no water and there's no food and there's no medicine and all the buildings are getting destroyed and thousands of people are getting killed and half the population's children. So half the casualties are going to be children. And it's horrible. It's absolutely ghastly. And what are the Israelis getting from it? What are they going to gain from it? Like nothing. They're not. Are they going to take that and make that part of Israel? Nope. I think that ship has sailed, right? But then they started to torpedo this whole. But part of that process was to support Hamas. That's another thing that I'm grateful more people are aware of than before. It wasn't a secret that elements within Israel supported and promoted Hamas. They didn't necessarily create it and they didn't necessarily control it. This isn't a case of necessarily where some conspiracy theorists would take it to the point of saying Hamas is just a puppet of the Israeli government. I don't think that was ever true. Or if it was, it's certainly not now. But it was useful to their aims because by having a competitor to the PLO, you couldn't have a unified Palestinian state. There's no one to negotiate with. And so there is no two-state solution. There's no two states. But that means there's just one state that oppresses completely, millions of its own people. And you can say that's not like what we had in South Africa because it's not based on who's black and who's white. Or I think the test in South Africa was actually if they could stick a pencil through your hair, and if they couldn't, then it was too curly and you're black, and right, you were Bantu. But like, it is a system with at least two tiers, where you have Jews who have all legal rights, and if you're super Jewish, you have even more legal rights because you get all the protections of the state, but you have none of the obligations. So there's that. I mean, so tier one, the Hasidic Orthodox Jews who contribute nothing to society and cause a lot of problems, but don't have to serve in the military. I don't even know if they have to pay taxes. I presume they do. Then you have secular Jews who have to be in the army and do all the fighting and protect and try and negotiate. But and then you have everyone who's not a Jew. And some of those people are allowed to live decent lives, but they can't have political power in the same way the Jews can, right? In aggregate or in an individual. And then you have people who have just none, who are occupied. These are occupied. I mean, if they're to say that they're not occupied territory, okay, so if they're not occupied, what are they? Is Gaza part of Egypt? No. Is the West Bank part of Jordan? No, it used to be, right? And then there was a war, and Israel took it from Jordan, and they took Gaza from the Egyptians. They took all of Sinai from the Egyptians at one point, gave it back, to their credit. By the way, by doing that, they haven't had a war with Egypt since, right? That might that not be a good idea, right? So, I mean, this could go on and on and on. This whole also, I've talked about it in other places, but the connection for the Jews that are immigrating to Israel that founded the state of Israel, their connection to historic Israel is so tenuous and so ridiculous that I don't understand how anyone can take it seriously. And even if that connection was real, even if Ben Shapiro could prove that his great-grandfather 200 times over lived in Judea and was a victim of the Romans, I don't think, by the way, I think the odds of that are extremely low, but let's just say that he could prove that. So the fuck what? That does not mean that he has the right to evict who's ever living there now, whether or not they're an Arab or a Palestinian or a Jew or whatever they might be. It doesn't. He wouldn't accept that for anything else. Because somebody who lives in America, or we know, if you're not a Native American, if you're not an Indian, then you're an immigrant and you displaced the Indians. Your ancestors did at some point anyway. Now, sometimes that displacement was horribly violent and sometimes it was kind of incidental because there were all these plagues that killed all the Native Americans and so their land was vacated, and then sometimes it was just straight up stolen. Right? More recently in things like the Black Hills, we just know the government signed a treaty and they just broke the treaty and said, we're just taking this anyway. Oh, did we say we were giving it to you forever? No, we're just taking it now. But would Ben Shapiro support the Lakota getting South Dakota back? Right? Would he support the Pequot getting Connecticut and saying, look, there really isn't an identity called Connecticut. They're just white. And there's 49 other white states, so they can go move someplace else. This belongs to the Pequot. And they can... And he could say, well, I mean, yes, there's archaeology showing, Indians lived here for 10,000, 15,000 years, but they weren't Pequot. They were all these other cultures. When they talk about the original Israel. We don't even know if the original Israel was a real state. I mean, Judea definitely was. Judea is pretty well documented. But when you start going back to the time of Solomon, the time of David, these are semi-mythical or at least legendary figures. We don't know that we haven't found a shred of evidence that King Solomon was a real person. He might have been. David might have been a real person. There's definitely stories about them, but the stories were written hundreds of years later. The northern kingdom of Israel was supposedly overthrown by the Assyrians. I don't know if it was Sennacherib or Anarbajipal, but like it hasn't. If it ever existed, it hasn't existed for 2,600, 2,700 years. And the Judean state came and go. I mean, that state was ruled by Rome for over 600 years. It was ruled by the Ottoman for hundreds of years, from the Mamluks in Egypt for hundreds of years, right? And to just say, I'm going to cherry pick this little bit of the history and all the other history, and like, because we're the original, but even their own stories are that they weren't the original, right? That they evicted the Canaanites, that they exterminated the Moabites and whoever else lived there because God said so. So it's like, again, truncating the antecedents. We're only going to focus on these periods where there was Jewish supremacy and then say those are the only periods that matter and everything else doesn't matter. And oh, by the way, all these Ashkenazi Jews who are from the Pale of Settlement, who are from Ukraine and Russia, right? That's where historically we know that they're from. What was their connection to Judea? Like, religiously, there's one, okay. There's a historical, like, literate connection, but there's a literal connection between, me and the Romans or the Greeks, because I've read their stuff, and you can read their stuff, and their cultures have influence on us. So therefore, I can go and just take land in Italy if I want. I can go move to Sicily or Greece and just say, look, I read a lot of Greek, and I consider myself influenced by their culture, so I have a right to this. And I could just point to the Greeks who live there and say, you're actually mostly Turk anyway, because this was the Ottoman Empire, just like Palestine was, only until 1820. So like, blah, blah, blah. It's so stupid. We don't even have to go into the whole, are the Khazars converted and they're not actually, like, it doesn't matter. I don't care if Ben Shapiro pulls out a form that proves that his great ancestor was buddies with Josephus and he survived the war because he's a traitor, but he, actually can trace his roots back to Judea. No. He doesn't have a legal claim against the Italians for what the Romans did. He doesn't have a land claim on Israel or any bit of land there because of who lived there up until 71 A.D. Doesn't. It's just absurd, right? And they have to drape it up in all these platitudes. And I heard, the Jews had a case, but they had the best advocates. The Palestinians had a much stronger case, but no advocates. Now that's changed. Now there is a lot of advocacy, and you can see there's been much more balanced coverage of this, I think. Maybe it's because I watch a lot of like British stuff and media from not just the United States. People tell me there's obviously a bias for Israel, for sure, but the Palestinian cause is out there as well, in a way that it wasn't in 1948 or 1973 or 1967. But they need to so there's a couple things. When the Romans took over Greece, a lot of Romans were enamored with Greek culture and Greek philosophy and Greek history, Greek music, everything, right? They just loved the Greeks. The Greeks have this vibrant culture that the Romans found themselves very drawn to. And then they're confronted with the fact that they conquered all the Greeks. And one of the ways they rationalized, like, yes, the Greeks had their freedom, and all they did with it was fight each other. All they did was have wars and kill each other and squander their wealth and their blood in petty disputes between Thebes and Corinth and Athens and Sparta. And so when the Romans showed up, there wasn't a unified Greece. There wasn't even an allied Greece. They were just a bunch of little city-states that were easily thrown aside. And so what they did with their liberties, they wasted it. So, as an anarchist, one of the things that Hamas is talking about is the Israelis they're not a legitimate state because the UN just said we're just evicting everyone and giving the Jews a state. And then they stole and they killed and they're not legitimate. Now, as far as states go, that's kind of what states do. But on the other side, you have this whole Jewish state thing, this Jewish democracy thing, right? Which means that the Israeli state is always going to have an underclass of non-Jews. just by definition. And if you want to say you don't want to call that apartheid because it's not like what you had in South Africa, fine. It's just a double standard where there's a Jewish supremacy within the state. Okay, whatever the word for that is. I think the word for that is actually Zionism. But so, two solutions are you just have no state at all and you just go to anarchy, which I would advocate, or you lose both states and they just become part of a greater empire. This is, you guys keep fighting, you guys can't take control of yourself. But then the question is who would do that? And like the answer is pretty much no one. The British don't want to do it. They probably couldn't. The Turks might want to do it. The Ottoman Empire ruled that whole area for something like 400 or 500 years. I think they conquered Jerusalem in the 16th century and held it until 1917, right? So, and, Jews and Arabs weren't fighting there, killing each other at that point. It wasn't until after they were gone that all this trouble really became violent. Zionism predates that, but it wasn't causing a lot of problems before that. So maybe the Turks come back. Or the other thing is that the Israelis, there become two states, but true two states where they're not occupied, they're not controlled, they're not completely dominated by the Israelis. They have to be viable states in that case. Or there's one state and they have equal rights. And the problem is they've been trying to suppress and destroy and circumvent and play games for so long, and there's so much animosity. How is that ever going to happen now? How is anyone in Gaza ever going to be an Israeli citizen now? And it's not, yes, they've made mistakes and they've done terrible things. Many people, the people involved in these attacks, they deserve to die. I don't know what else to say. When you show, it's a problem with somebody who starts decapitating bodies or decapitating people who aren't even combatants, which I did see evidence of that. They weren't children necessarily, but is you don't negotiate with somebody like that. They're just they're too wild and crazy and dangerous and so, okay. So, Israel, the logic of Zionism has kind of brought this to a head, and I think they need to adjust what Zionism means. There's other versions of Zionism that are much more benign. There were people who believed in Zionism who wanted to build a better world with their so-called Arab brothers. And it is interesting because Hebrew and Arabic are both Semitic languages, or they are related in that sense. There's no reason, they should be able to get along. They did get along. Jews and Arabs have lived together many times throughout history without any issue. There's been times when there's been issues, times where there's not issues, but they obviously can coexist is my point. But apparently they can't coexist when you have a Jewish Zionist supremacist state, right? But you could still have a state and it could have a lot of influence from Jews, and there could actually be a Jewish majority, as there would be demographically, at least at this point. And the other problem is long term, they're surrounded by a bunch of Arab states, and sooner or later those Arab states are going to get their shit together. They've already started to do that, but at some point they're going to get nukes. At some point they're going to become so overwhelmingly populous and wealthy and economically powerful that the idea that Israel is always going to have a perpetual advantage over them, that it can do what it wants and not really worry too much about the consequences, those days will not last forever. Either the world ends or we get to the point where Israel does not have such a huge advantage. And so it needs to get along with its neighbors. And one of the main reasons for this attack probably is to cause such an affront, to cause such suffering among the Gazans, that the rhetoric of the other states around Israel forces them to not get along with Israel, to end the Abraham Accords, to end normalization. So what Netanyahu has been trying to do is have normalization without addressing the Palestinians. We don't have two states and we don't have equality within one state. We have apartheid. We have a grossly unfair and unjust system standing on the foundations of our religious myths and historical revisionism, which is not compelling reasons to evict people and to kill them and to make them second class or third class or fourth class citizens. Maybe if we bribe the Arabs enough, they'll let us get around with it. And then, we'll just have these couple million of Palestinians that are orphans of the world, which they were becoming, which, by the way, has given them an identity all their own, right? I think that might be the big takeaway, Israel has created Palestinians. If you want to say that they didn't exist before, fine. That's semantic. So they were just Arabs. Well, now they're not just Arabs. They're Palestinians now. They have a flag and they have a unique identity, and that identity is anti-Zionist. And in many cases, truly anti-Semitic as well. Yes. Some anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitic. Some of it is. But the way that some of it is anti-Semitic as well. But you treat people like this, yeah, some of them are going to become anti-Semitic. And some of them were anyway. I mean, I would say that the anti-Semitism can exist without the state of Israel. That's for sure. But Zionism has not cured anti-Semitism, especially among the Gazans. So, you know, I think people like Ben Shapiro, people like Benjamin Netanyahu should realize what they're doing here. They're giving the Gazans something to build an identity on, and that identity is going to be against it. Already, this has already happened, and this is making it stronger. It's kind of, again, to draw parallels with the war in Ukraine. People argued, Russians would dismiss Ukraine and say it's the Ukraine, it's not Ukraine. It's just part of Russia. They're just little Russians. They're just us, and they have an identity crisis. They've been fooled by the West, blah, blah, blah. That there's no historical state in Ukraine. And I agree in the sense, like, it's kind of silly to see these attempts to cast history as Ukrainian state building exercises. So people will start, the Zaporizhia Siege is a state or whatever. I think that's kind of silly. But let's just assume that's all true. And let's even assume things like Ukrainian is just Russian, blah, blah, blah. This war has given them an identity now that they can be proud of too, because they can, even if they lose the war now, even if they didn't have a single victory, they could share that in common. Of course, as it's turned out, they've had enough victories now that they could fuel a Ukrainian identity for 1,000 years at this point, right? Other societies and other countries have taken smaller things and created identities based on them. And Israel is giving this to the Palestinians. So unless they exterminate all of them, which ultimately I don't think they're willing to do and maybe not able to do. Of course, they can't kill the ones who aren't there. And the reactions that are going to happen from everybody else, I mean, where does that put them? So they can't do that. So, yeah, they've really put themselves in a bad... The logic of Zionism is kind of bearing its very bitter fruit here. And there were people at the time who said that this would happen, and it has, and it's proven the point. And you just have too many people who are in fucking denial about it, who just think Israel never did anything wrong. It's all those evil Palestinians. You always hear, like, we offered them peace. What was the offer, bitch? Like, if you offer them a peace that's humiliating, that's unfair, that's unjust, and they reject it, then it's not really just on them at that point. So, anyway, I could go on about this for hours. Let me know what you guys think. How would you rate the media coverage in the United States? Obviously, it's slanted pro-Israel, but you do hear a lot on the pro-Palestinian side, I think, relatively speaking, better than at least in the past. So, what do you people think? And also, good to see you all again. Anyway, have a good day.